Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Europe podcast. Good morning. It's Friday, the 29th of August. I'm Caroline Hepker in London. Coming up today, Germany's Merz pours cold water on a Putin-Zelenskiy meeting as a devastating strike kills more than 20 people and damages the EU's Ukraine headquarters. The Fed's Christopher Waller says he would support a quarter-point rate reduction as he opens the door to going further and stocks hit a new record high. Plus, reforming its appeal to business. Polling shared exclusively with Bloomberg shows lobbyists are lining up to attend the annual conference of Nigel Farage's Populist Party. Let's start with a roundup of our top stories. A meeting between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and Russia's Vladimir Putin is unlikely to happen, according to the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz. US President Donald Trump had talked up the possibility of a gathering of the two leaders after he held talks with Putin in Alaska. But during a conference with the French President Emmanuel Macron, Merz told reporters that a meeting is highly unlikely.
But tonight, we also want to talk again, just the two of us, about the big issues of our time, because we have some tasks that we can only solve together. Unfortunately, this includes Russia's ongoing war against Ukraine. We must revisit this issue today, given that it is clear that a meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin will not take place. This is in contrast to what was agreed between President Trump and President Putin last week when we were together in Washington.
Merz's comments, spoken there via a translator, follow the deadliest Russian airstrikes on Kyiv since July, in which more than 20 people, including several children, were killed. A European Union office and a British Council building in the capital have also been damaged in the attack. The EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, says the onslaught shows the scale of Russia's threat to Europe.
It shows that the Kremlin will stop at nothing to terrorize Ukraine, blindly killing civilians, men, women and children, and even targeting the European Union. This is why we are keeping maximum pressure on Russia. That means tightening our sanctions regime.
Ursula von der Leyen's comments were echoed by the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, who condemned the, quote, senseless Russian attack on Kyiv. The US has approved Ukraine's request to buy thousands of long-range missiles worth up to $825 million and funded NATO allies. The approval marks the first formal use of a new mechanism that President Donald Trump approved to allow nations to buy American weaponry for Ukraine. France, Germany and the UK have referred Iran to the United Nations to face the re-imposition of international sanctions over its nuclear program. According to the European powers, the Islamic Republic failed to comply with demands to negotiate with the US and allow nuclear inspectors to resume their work. Europe's biggest economies told the UN Security Council that they triggered a 30-day snapback process that would reinstate sanctions originally lifted as part of a 2015 deal. Iran has threatened to leave the international treaty on nuclear non-proliferation if UN sanctions resume. Such a move would permanently throttle nuclear inspections and also create deeper ambiguity about Iran's atomic activities. The European Union has adopted draft regulations to remove all tariffs on US industrial goods following a demand from President Trump. According to the European Commission, the move, which also gives preferential treatment to some US agricultural products, will also pave the way for the US to reduce its tariffs on European cars and auto parts down to 15% from 27%. The proposal is still subject to parliamentary approval, though, but Bloomberg understands that the EU expects that the US will be able to lower its levies on the region immediately. Let's get to the central bank in the US. So the Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller says that he would support a 25 basis point rate cut in September, and he expects further cuts in the coming months. Waller, whom the Trump administration is considering as a candidate to replace current chair Jerome Powell, added that he's leaving the door open to a jumbo half-point rate cut if the data points to a significant deterioration in US growth. Here is what he told an audience at an event that was hosted by the Economic Club of Miami.
Well, I judge that the FOMC should have begun this process in July based on the data in hand. I don't believe that a cut of larger than 25 basis points is needed in September. Now, that view, of course, could change if the employment report for August, due out a week from tomorrow, points to a substantially weakening economy and inflation remains well contained.
Christopher Waller. His comments are the first by a top Fed official since President Trump moved this week to fire fellow central bank governor Lisa Cook. The Fed has kept US interest rates unchanged so far in 2025. Yesterday, Fed Governor Lisa Cook sued to block what she called President Trump's illegal attempt to remove her, saying that he has no cause and denied her due process. The case centres on allegations that she listed two homes as her primary residence in 2021, therefore gaining better mortgage terms. Her lawyer suggests this may have been an unintentional clerical error and was not done with the intention to deceive. Cook's lawsuit also says that the attempt to remove both her and Jerome Powell are part of President Trump's efforts to seize control of the Federal Reserve as part of his campaign to lower rates. Despite growing concerns over the Trump administration's efforts to erode Fed independence, solid US economic figures helped drive stocks to a record high yesterday, with the S&P 500 above 6,500 points for the first time ever. Just 24 hours ahead of the release of the Fed's favoured price gauge, data shows the US economy expanded faster than had initially been estimated. Inflation-adjusted GDP increased at a 3.3% pace in the second quarter, underscoring the resilience of America's primary growth engine, consumer spending. And lastly, here in the UK, a think tank says that the Chancellor should raise billions of pounds of much-needed revenue by imposing a windfall tax on commercial lenders. Bloomberg's Ewan Potts has more.
The plans from the left-leaning Institute for Public Policy Research says the government should look to recover the profits banks are making from taxpayers on deposits held at the Bank of England. It says high street lenders have enjoyed a, quote, staggering state subsidy on the BOE's QE programme in recent years. Across the current 5-year parliamentary term, the report suggests the Treasury could raise a total of £32.3 billion. In London, I'm Ewan Potts, Bloomberg Radio.
And those are our top stories for you this morning. Let's have a think about the markets. We are awaiting a couple of big earnings out of China, Alibaba and BYD. Chinese equities have extended this incredible run in August, but then also we saw the S&P 500 close at a record high, as I mentioned just there earlier yesterday. In terms of stock futures, we're down for the S&P 500 a 1/10%. US Stocks 50 futures are also nursing losses. This, as in the bond markets, it's just an incredible week. This has been a real pivotal point. The political pressure on the Fed only mounting, but bond markets really are still very sanguine about this. 10-year US yields trading up a basis point at 4.21, 30-year yields trading at 4.88, also higher, only a basis point today. And then thinking about the dollar, which had seen losses for 3 successive sessions, the Bloomberg Dollar Spot Index this morning is actually firmer, 0.1%. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk more about our exclusive reporting that shows that the UK business community is increasingly taking Nigel Farage's Reform Party seriously as an electoral force. A special report here for Bloomberg Radio. But I also want to dig into today's top story. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz says that there is obviously not going to be a meeting between President Zelensky and President Putin to resolve the war in Ukraine, even as Russia launched a major air attack on Kyiv in defiance of the US's pleas to end the fighting. Our head of Middle East and North Africa coverage, Stuart Livingston-Wallace, joins us now for more on this. Stuart, good morning. The White House press secretary says that Trump is, quote, not happy with Putin, but then equally she framed the latest Russian airstrike as a response to Ukraine's Russia oil refinery attacks. What is the state of the conflict now, and also, very importantly, of US military support for Ukraine?
Yeah, good morning. So, I think there is quite a significant change here going on, certainly in terms of the front line. So it's really, I suppose, a combination of things. And you can start, let's say, with the US, which has to some extent resumed supplies to Ukraine. That's making quite a big difference. Secondarily, you're seeing more munitions coming in from the Europeans into Ukraine, and that's sort of giving them the ability to counter the previous Russian strategy of sort of wave after wave of soldiers being sent into specific areas to try and break through the front lines. But I think the third thing, and perhaps the most important, is a change in the Russian strategy. So you've seen a sort of a shift away from those waves of soldiers coming in to much more incremental moves by smaller groups of soldiers, combined with quite a significant change in the air war strategy. And, as you mentioned, there have been some very significant attacks with sort of hundreds of drones combined with missile attacks coming in simultaneously as a way of trying to overwhelm the Ukrainian defences. And it is having some effect, certainly in terms of the amount of damage being caused in Ukraine. And that is a function, I think, of a change in the Russian manufacturing strategy. So previously they would bring in pretty much completed drones from some of their suppliers, notably Iran. And what seems to have changed is they are still bringing in the components, but they're putting them together themselves. And that makes it much, much more difficult to disrupt the supply chains. So they have a lot more equipment to throw at the Ukrainians in one go. Simultaneously, they are running out of the stockpiles that they accumulated over many decades of sort of the older military equipment, right back to the Soviet era. And so there is a change there in terms of what you're seeing.
So then, on the comments that I mentioned from Friedrich Merz, openly critical of President Trump's peace push in Ukraine, this was at a dinner with the French President Emmanuel Macron. What at this stage, with all of these moving parts then, is the European strategy on Ukraine, if there is one?
I mean, I think it's been reasonably consistent in the last, certainly the last several months, and arguably in the last several years. I mean, the amount of aid going from Europe into Ukraine has been substantial, and I think the war to date, we're looking at something like 60 billion euros in aid one way or another. And just sort of to give you a flavour of the scale of it, the EU has pledged to provide Ukraine with something like 2 million rounds of ammunition in 2025. So it is large scale. At the same time, you're seeing some very interesting developments in terms of the Europeans' willingness to fund purchases from elsewhere. So there was a very interesting thing overnight where we've had preliminary approval from the State Department to supply Ukraine with something like, I think it's just over 3,000 long-range missiles to Ukraine, a big chunk of which will be paid for by Denmark, the Netherlands and Norway. So that is also new. Now, that still has to go to Congress for approval, but it looks pretty likely. So I would say the scale of the EU intervention is still pretty large and is having some impact.
What about President Trump and these very serious consequences that he has threatened? I suppose the risk for Putin is that President Trump does actually act against Russia, perhaps quite suddenly.
I think you're absolutely right, and I think we got a flavour of that with the way that it dealt with India. One of the big purchasers of Russian oil with these, the tariffs, and you have seen a very small incremental, but nonetheless, I think significant change in terms of the Russian oil flows out. Now, the risk here for the US is, the US president is intent on bringing down interest rates, and in an environment where he put secondary sanctions, very harsh secondary sanctions on any buyers of Russian commodities. You're going to see, you would have thought, some increase in the energy price, perhaps quite significant, and other commodities. And then that has an inflationary impact and it makes it much more difficult then to lower interest rates. So there is a domino effect here that he's going to have to be mindful of. But I think you're absolutely right that you've already started to see signs of that. And there is no doubt that I think there is a great deal of frustration on the US side that even after the summit in Alaska, they appear to be no further forward than where they were, several months ago.
Stuart, thank you so much for being with me. Stuart Livingston-Wallace is our head of Middle East and North Africa coverage with the latest when it comes to Ukraine. Thank you so much.
Stay with us. More from Bloomberg Daybreak Europe coming up after this.
OK, let's get to a story here in the UK. Lobbyists are lining up to attend Reform UK's annual conference, which takes place next week. 20% of public affairs executives are planning to head to Nigel Farage's event, according to data obtained exclusively by Bloomberg. It's a sign that corporate Britain is increasingly taking the Populist Party seriously as an electoral force. Our UK politics reporter James Walcock has more and joins me this morning. James, what does this poll actually show that we've managed to put together?
So the narrative of British politics Last 12 months has been Labour's calamitous drop in polling at almost record rates. And Reform UK, this populist party led by Nigel Farage, emerging into this gap to become currently polling the most popular party in Britain. We have been trying to find out how serious and substantial that polling lead is. Will it hold? And one of the key tests for us here at Bloomberg is, are business interested? And so I've got my hands on this poll of people who are in public affairs. This is both lobbying groups, but also any business that is big enough to have a public relations wing. So often this is ones that are in government, so finance, health, education, these types of areas. And 2 years ago, only 4% of the 300 executives polled went to Reform. Last year, 12%. This year, next week, at their conference, 20% of those we polled say they will go. That is a rapid rise and puts them very clearly ahead of any of the minor parties, 4% behind the Conservatives, the other major party in sort of British politics on the right, and Labour as the government dominate with 48%, but it quite clearly establishes Reform as a party that is growing in political and business heft. Now, I spoke to Opinium's head, they did this poll, of public affairs, James Crouch. He told me for the first time businesses are taking Reform seriously.
You can't ignore them anymore. Whether or not this trend continues and whether or not more resource will eventually be put into them, I think that depends on how the headline polling goes over the next year, and we'll be looking particularly intently at the next local elections, because that would be the next electoral sign that actually Reform are in contention for government, and you definitely won't be able to ignore them.
So James Crouch there, and he adds that the key question for a lot of the people that he was talking to for this poll was next week, what kind of conference is it? Is it a professional affair? Because he says soon, if the trend continues, Reform could easily rival the Conservatives as one of the two key fixtures of conference season.
Yes, which is so fascinating, isn't it? And I also thought it was very interesting that the poll speaks to small, medium and large businesses. It was broken up into lots of, as you say, different sectors of the economy, different scale of businesses too, which I think gives us some very kind of granular insights actually into how business thinks about this. It comes, though, as the Labour government faces all of these tough questions over their credentials about whether or not they are the party of business. I mean, this was the thing that we followed in the election campaign.
I mean, just this morning, there is a report out from the sort of left-wing think tank, the IPPR, talking about a potential windfall tax on banks coming down the track. Now, look, no one at this point knows what is going to be in Chancellor Rachel Reeves's autumn budget, but most economists are saying there is going to be a public issue with the finances, and the one that she will have to fill by raising taxes or cutting spending somewhere. And that has a lot of businesses worried that they will be the targets. Now, look, sources in government have told me just this week that they have taken note of the business response and they are looking to try and keep UK PLC on side. But after last year, where, as you were saying, Caroline, all the talk in the lead up to the election was the smoked salmon offensive and Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer building relations with business, and then there was this massive rise in national insurance taxes on business. And so a lot of business leaders you've seen in the press have felt quite betrayed this year. The question is for Labour is, especially in this autumn, where we're likely to get the employment rights bill as well, what is the offering to sort of woo business back? Meanwhile, as we get into conference season, we'll be seeing the rival pitches from other parties.
Yes, but my question for conference season is also whether any political party is facing the very difficult questions that Britain has, right, of indebtedness, of government spending and addressing those. And that is the same very tough question for Reform. It's the question that we put to Nigel Farage when he spoke to us at the start of this year. And so again, it's, can Nigel Farage emerge as a serious contender for Prime Minister? And what does that path look like?
To your point, there is curiosity. There is deep curiosity in the people that we've spoken to. This poll was commissioned by the Chartered Institute of Public Relations because they also are our members trying to get involved with reform. Everyone is trying to figure out how serious is this nascent political party? How much heft does it have? How lobbyable are they? How much influence do they have? Business are asking, is this a group that we could work with? Is this a group that we can influence? And the other thing I found fascinating is the money is going there too. The average spend on Reform's conference is 17,000 per company that we polled. That's half Labour and the Conservatives, but their conference is only half in length. So that's not too out of order. Of the 300 executives in public affairs we polled, 4 of their companies were putting in more than 100,000 into Reform's conference next week. Okay. So we are finding out that there is increasingly a risk in not checking out Reform. That's what the CIPR told me. At this point, you'd be a fool not to.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak Europe, your morning brief on the stories making news from London to Wall Street and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed every morning on Apple, Spotify and anywhere else you get your podcasts.
You can also listen live each morning on London DAB Radio, the Bloomberg Business app and Bloomberg.com.
Our flagship New York station is also available on your Amazon Alexa devices. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130. I'm Caroline Hepker.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day, right here on Bloomberg Daybreak Europe.